Good afternoon. Welcome to our keynote presentation for ITS Day 2018. We are extremely fortunate to have with us this afternoon Dr. Crocker, who is an internet pioneer. Before we hear from Dr. Crocker, we will present him with an award to recognize his contribution to internet innovation. And to start that process, I will say a few words about Dr. Crocker's work. As a graduate student at UCLA, Dr. Crocker was tasked to lead a team to get the world's first computer network, ARPANET, up and running. To do this, computer research centers at UCLA, at the Stanford Research Institute, at UC Santa Barbara, and at the University of Utah had to be connected. No one had ever done such a thing before. As Dr. Crocker wrestled with the complexity of this problem, it occurred to him that decisions made at UCLA could have an impact at all of the other network's nodes. Something going wrong at UCLA could affect something at Stanford or at the University of Utah. So recognizing that the actions taken at any network node could have a negative repercussion on any other network node led Dr. Crocker to do some thinking. It was risky business to make a decision in such an environment, especially so for a graduate student. As anyone who's ever been a graduate student knows, the very last thing you want to do is to generate problems for your faculty supervisors. So Dr. Crocker envisioned a solution that would lessen the chances that decisions made at UCLA would tread upon the toes of researchers at the other network nodes. Dr. Crocker humbly named his solution the Request for Comment, or RFC. The RFCs would inform all who were working on the problems of creating the first computer network with what other researchers were doing with regard to those same problems. It would allow an open and inclusive approach to problem solving and innovation. Rather than top-down command and control, researchers would compare ideas and refine solutions to common challenges. The foundation provided by the RFC created an incubator for internet innovation. The RFC process supported and continues to support the development of key innovations of our internet era. For example, transformative technologies such as the Transmission Control Protocol, or TCP, which was invented by Vint Cerf and Robert Kahn, was introduced through RFC 793 by Jonathan Postel, and it provided the foundation for internetworking. Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP, the foundation of the World Wide Web, was advanced by Tim Berners-Lee through RFC 1945. The Session Initiation Protocol, the foundation of voice over internet applications, was introduced by Jonathan Rosenberg in RFC 3261. While there's some debate as to who the true father of the internet is, I believe that there's no doubt that Dr. Crocker is the father of internet innovation. However, it's important to note that Dr. Crocker's creation of the RFC has had an impact that extends beyond the technical operations of the internet. The RFC inspired a philosophy of openness and collaborative innovation. The RFC process has proved that when many eyes view the same problem, superior solutions are generated by the collaborative process that follows. The success generated by the RFC process has inspired open source approachment to technology development and knowledge creation that has led to innovations like Linux and wiki-based problem solving. Dr. Crocker's contributions did not end with the RFC creation. Dr. Crocker was a founding member of the ARPANET Network Working Group, the precursor of the Internet Engineering Task Force, or IETF, an organization that he continued to serve. He was the IETF's first area director for security, and he also served on the IETF Administrative Oversight Committee. In addition, he served on the Internet Architecture Board and on the board of the Internet Society. Dr. Crocker provided extensive service to the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICON, which concluded with his serving as ICON's chair starting in 2011, continuing to his retirement in November of 2017. In addition to this extensive public service, Dr. Crocker has also somehow found time to have an active profile in the private sector. He co-founded Cybercache Incorporated, Longitude Systems Incorporated, and his current company, Shinkuro Incorporated. For all of these reasons, we recognize Dr. Crocker's remarkable contributions to innovation. I will now turn the presentation over to Dean Titsworth, who will present the Stroger Award.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by saying that Trevor has done an outstanding job of planning not only this event, but the other events I believe that went on for ITS Day. So let's give him a hand for all of that work. In 1891, Almond Stroger was issued a patent for the first electromechanical telephone switch. Prior to Stroger's invention, telephone switching was completed using human operators. I actually remember that, believe it or not. As legend has it, Stroger, an undertaker by trade, believed that one of the telephone operators in his town was diverting business to his rival on the other side. As the saying goes, necessity is the mother of invention, and Stroger's automatic switch revolutionized the telephone industry, yet we do not know how it impacted his undertaking business. Recognizing the role that innovation in information and telecommunication industries plays, the J. Warren McClure School presents the Stroger Award to distinguished innovators in the field. This year, we honor Dr. Stephen Crocker, whose work on the RFC and numerous other technologies laid the foundation for the internet revolution, as Trevor eloquently explained. The J. Warren McClure School is proud to recognize Dr. Crocker's many accomplishments. Please join me in congratulating Dr. Crocker as he receives the Stroger Award. Too many things.
Thank you. Too many things.
You want to stand right over here? Why don't you get on the other side? Okay. Oh, where he's here, so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll put this back. Congratulations.
Thank you very
Very
much.
happy to have you here.
Pleasure. Good. Good. Well, thank you, Dean. Thank you, Professor Roycroft. It's a genuine honor and a real pleasure to be here today. The words about my accomplishments always make me a little uncomfortable because they took place a long time ago, and in some ways I still feel like a kid. And now I'm back on college campus here. I've got a couple of stories to share with you and a bunch of slides to help do that. There's a few notes buried where you can't see them on the attachments to the notes section of the slides, and I'll leave a copy of the slides. So some of this is for follow-up in case people are interested, and you'll see me going through these at variable speed. First, thank yous to a few folks, some living, some not living, including our man Stroger. And you'll see how these show up a little. Uh-oh. There we go. So there's our hero. You've all lived through a good portion of the internet revolution. Here's a slide and another one that follows that shows the awareness of the internet from a much earlier day. The picture on the left is the group at Bolt, Brannick, and Newman that built the first routers that were part of the ARPANET, and that was the entire team. Tom Brokaw introduces the idea of the internet in 1988 on television, and eventually everybody and their grandmother became aware of the internet. That's a picture of Scott Bradner's mother. Could have been my mother-in-law, who was a little quizzical when my wife tried to introduce me. My wife, her parents were a medical family, academic medical family, and he's not a doctor? A network? What's this network all about? And at one critical moment of very high tension, when I tried to bring a terminal into their house when my wife was ill and they were managing her care, my mother-in-law, in the only confrontation that I ever had with her, met me at the door and saw this terminal that I was lugging at the time and said, "There's no room for that in this house." But time passed, and over the years, as my father-in-law retired and started a newsletter that my mother-in-law managed and was the publisher and ran it out of the house, we offered her a laptop so that she could manage the books and so forth. She took enormous delight in stealing the Wi-Fi signals from the neighbor's house. And our relationship improved considerably. So here's the other half of that slide. These are a bit dated, as you can see, and put together a while ago, but still tell part of that story. And here's sort of a picture. This is from 1999, and the internet was already too big to detail, but one can get a picture just from this particular graph exercise. Well, we're going to have to figure out. So I want to talk a little bit about each of these topics, a little bit about the history prior to the creation of the ARPANET, which then led into the internet, some of the results that I think are useful to focus on, and a little bit of looking ahead. Professor Roycroft suggested to me that what you really want to hear is what's going to happen in the future. I don't know. You know better than I, so I'll say only a little about that, but I'll say perhaps some things. Throughout all of this, there are, I think, some repetitive themes, and those are three. One is that we have been living, and we will continue to live, on a very, very big wave of technology improvements, and that's what fuels all of this. On the other hand, the nature of us, humans, doesn't really change. And so you've got two things that are happening in parallel. One is enormous technological change, and the other is the totality of human behavior, which is pretty much the same this year, last year, 100 years ago, and 100 years in the future. Together, those two things are not quite enough to explain what happened and what's going to happen. There's a lot of luck, quite often some very good luck. There we go. So on the technology side, on the left side, the biggest thing that has hit us is Moore's Law. How many of you have heard of Moore's Law? Oh, that's great. So you get slight differences in the way it's stated. For me, the easiest is a factor of 10 improvement every 5 years. That means that in 10 years, you have a 100-fold improvement. In 40 years, that is 100 million times better than it was 40 years previously. That seems extraordinary. This is, if you put it into an annual rate of return, this is close to 60% per year. There is nothing ever in the whole history of humanity that has ever changed quite like that. Everybody's excited if you can get 2 or 3 or 4% more productivity per year. This is a 60% per year, every year, for a very, very long time. Has to come to an end at some point. Lots of differences of opinion as to exactly how and when it's going to subside. Hasn't subsided yet, and it's got at least a few more cycles to go. And on the other side, not just the raw power of more computing available, cheaper and cheaper, faster and faster for less money, but also quite a lot of understanding of how to use computers to do increasingly complicated things. So you have artificial intelligence, you have very fancy graphics. In the early days, I spent a few years as a program manager at the Defense Department in an Advanced Research Projects Agency, spending your money. As a relative youngster, I think I spent about $50 million, which was a lot of money in those days, part of which we spent on early speech understanding research. Today, you talk to Siri and Alexa and just get annoyed if it doesn't understand you and you don't pay anything for it. That was complete science fiction back then. Here's some, there we go. Here's some data that you can get off of the net, and there's a reference to, there's a professor in Singapore who kept track of this, and I thought this is interesting. The critical thing is that the scale on the left is a logarithmic scale, and so what's essentially a straight line is representing exponential decline, which is the same as what we were showing before. But just to show that the Moore's law gross figure is backed up by measurements which have been carefully taken, and you can get this in various sources. Well, we're in a university, and I get to pontificate a little bit. One of my favorite pieces of writing is by an early 1900s naturalist, J.B.S. Haldane, who's written a lot, and he's a relatively famous guy. But he wrote an essay on being the right size. It's only a few pages, and if I were in charge of education for the world, I would have everybody read this, and I would have them reread it once a year. It's my favorite discussion about scaling, and the basic message is that you can't take any kind of dynamic system. He was talking about animals primarily, and to some extent plants, but it applies to anything that's got dynamic nature to it. You can't scale it up or you scale it down without rather large changes in structure that have to accompany that. The initial example is mammals, animal organisms, but warm-blooded animals, require oxygen that is proportional to their weight, which is roughly proportional to their volume, but the surface area only grows as a square, and as you scale up, you have to do something to make it possible to take in more and more air. That's why we have very complicated lungs, but a small animal, not a mammal, but an ant, for example, just osmoses air from the skin and doesn't have a complicated lung structure nor a complicated circulatory system. That may not seem relevant, but I think it is absolutely core to everything that we've been involved in. Scaling is just really intrudes, and you will see it if you look in every aspect of our lives, not just technical, but organizational as well. So there's my little plug to make this an academic talk. Meanwhile, on the other side, about us humans, we are complicated, and we are characterized by a whole lot of different attributes. Some you might think of as relatively positive, and some as relatively negative, although it's not entirely clear that every one of these can be assigned uniquely to one side or the other. Competition is important. It helps make things go. Competition is sometimes destructive. We have various forms of charity and cooperation and so forth that are very helpful. And we have a lot of things that we're maybe not so proud of, but they exhibit themselves in every setting all the time, and we sort of deal with it for better or for worse. And I'll come back. You'll see how this matches up and connects up with what we're going to talk about. One of the areas that we've all experienced is innovation in markets. The basic lessons in first course in economics is supply and demand, and it's all based on free entry of providers and various others, nice, clean assumptions, none of which actually apply in the real world. What actually happens in the real world is people look for an advantage. You have first mover advantage. You have various kinds of regulatory or patent controls and copyright controls that help give advantage to various people. You have people who take advantage in unpleasant ways. And then you have to figure out whether or not this works to general advantage or whether or not you have to stop it in some fashion or intrude a little bit in the process. So that's just sort of general set of things. Let me take you back in time. The ARPANET was started basically 50 years ago. You'll see a bullet or two about this. But in 1968, the formal process of initiating the contracts for building the portions of the network started, and the first nodes were put in a year later. So let me take you back to the precursor, to the antecedents of that time. Computing was in its early stages, and computers were expensive. This is taken out of the files of this school. This is what it looked like if you were here 50 years ago, approximately, or more than 50 years ago. This was the key punch room. Anybody have an idea what a key punch is? Yeah, I can see the ages too, mostly. How come you know? Yeah, I see. I was pretty good actually with those things. I can put together a drum card and produce things. And the computer, this is not from your files, but it's a picture of the kind of computer that was here at that time, was a relatively modest LibreScope LGP30, and it was either a user at a time or somebody putting a bunch of punch cards through and running a batch process at the time. Things have grown quite a bit since then. So the computer setting at that time was computers were very expensive comparatively, and they had to be used in a very efficient fashion. So people sort of lined up and jobs were put in one at a time, or they were all batched up and sent in on a tape or some other mechanism. And the programming process, you were quite distant from the computer. So those were mainframes with batch processing. National Science Foundation was beginning to put money into academic computing. That meant, academic computing for them meant, how do they provide computer power for people who needed answers off of computers? Not computer scientists, term didn't exist. Departments didn't exist. The whole study area didn't really exist. How do you support physicists who were doing serious calculations, for example? But in a few places, around Boston and in a few other places, there were the beginnings of time-sharing systems for interactive computing that would serve multiple people, graphics that were a lot more interesting than just typing on punch cards, very far-out ideas of man-machine and artificial intelligence research, and the creation of a funding agency called, at that time, ARPA, which later became known as DARPA, and that was the thing. So let me tell you a little bit about ARPA. Late '57, the Russians put up the first satellite, and it caused a shockwave through the US government. We had had a very vigorous space program. Well, we had had more than one vigorous space program. We had the Army pursuing it, the Navy pursuing it. They were competing with each other, and they were screwing up and not getting very far. The message that was understood in the high levels of the government were, if the Russians could put up a basketball-sized object up in space, they could put more serious things anywhere in the world, like an intercontinental ballistic missile delivering nuclear warhead. Oh my goodness, that's not good. We have to fix this. They created a unique agency within the Department of Defense, but not within the Army, Navy, or Air Force. They plugged it directly into the Secretary of Defense's office and gave it a Star Trek-like mission. Prevent technological surprise. You figure it out. You choose the problems, and you go make it happen. Here's a bunch of money. And they gave it an enormous amount of bureaucratic latitude. And one of the first things they did was marshal the different parts of the government's space program and put the pieces together. NASA was created out of that, and the military space program created out of that. And then they went on to do some other things. So that was 58, 59, and then a couple of years later, we had, and there's, I'm not going to spend any time on this, but the name changed back and forth for very minor, humble bureaucratic reasons. And as I say, I'll leave these slides and you can study it. So in the early 60s, the Information Processing Techniques Office, one portion of this agency, was created, focused on command and control, but more broadly on what were really the beginnings of organized research in computer science, with focus on big ideas. The artificial intelligence, graphics, supercomputer architectures, And underlying all of this was, how do you get the computers to be useful so people have good use of their think time as they're interacting? So it's time sharing and other forms of interaction. And centers of excellence were set up at MIT, at Carnegie Mellon University, at Berkeley, at Harvard, at a number of other places, Stanford Research Institute, now known as SRI International, other places around the country. And rather than kind of spreading the money in a somewhat uniform way where everybody gets some, the focus was on enough money to make a difference, pick some best people, and give them a lot of room. And an environment of a couple dozen research centers were set up at that time. And all along, there was a vision that in aggregate, it would be great if these people talked to each other. It would be great if the information that was available across all of these things. It would be great if the computers that were serving these people could communicate with each other. And so you had the grand plan, plan's too big a word, you had the grand idea, the grand vision of a network not exactly envisioned as it is today, but in broad terms, pushing that way. And they did some early experiments in trying to connect different computers together, some of which didn't work so well, but the thought and the impetus was there nonetheless. And so that's, I think I've covered the main pieces of this on this net. And all of that led to this early network, the ARPANET. So the first, so the perspective from sitting inside the Pentagon, handing out all of this money and watching the research being done is now let's make a serious effort at building a network. And we have a captive audience of all these research sites at these different universities. They're taking our money, and therefore we can kind of suggest that it would be very good if we connected them together, and they can hardly say no. Some of them were not too happy, but others were delighted. A decision was made to build a network that started on the West Coast with these 4 sites, UCLA, SRI, up in Menlo Park, University of California, Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. And at that time, some critical pieces came together from different directions. One was that packet switching was a very useful technology, which I'll explain a little more in a minute. And the other was that we could, with the falling prices and of computing and the availability of cheaper and cheaper computers, could actually afford to put a separate computer at each site devoted to the communications task. So those are what we would now call routers. For this project, they were called interface message processors, or IMPs, a cute word. And those circles on that chart are the IMPs, and that was the beginning of this network. So you had an IBM 360 at Santa Barbara, a Sigma 7 at UCLA, and in order for them to talk, each would talk to the IMP, which was physically right next to it, and then the IMPs would talk to each other over long-distance phone lines. Let's see. One of the discussion points that gets confused over time is, so what was the purpose of all this? One of the things that I always have sort of qualms about is, well, this was packet switching, which is a survivable technology, and it was done by the Defense Department, must have been for nuclear survivability. Not so. And I can say that with a fair amount of authority, but nonetheless, there are still certain threads of confusion. The primary purpose was, as I said, to get these computers to talk to each other and to make efficient use of the communications. If you're going to build a survivable network, you're in a somewhat different territory from a design point of view, because you don't want it to work only under normal circumstances or with normal kinds of breakage. You want it to work under the most extreme stress with huge amounts of traffic all of a sudden and reduction in capability and chaos breaking out all over. We didn't spend any time on that aspect. Nonetheless, as I dig into the history, one of the key people, a director of the agency, a very, very good guy and a good friend, has actually written why I signed the checks on this. And he included nuclear survivability. When I've had a recent conversation with him about, this really doesn't make any sense, he says, well, look, this made it easy for me to explain to higher levels in the Defense Department and to Congress, and it wasn't necessary that it happen right now, but down the line some. Well, okay, but I can tell you from firsthand experience that all of the work was done on the ordinary use, if you will, leading basically to where we are today. So that was the focus. And here's a picture of what that router looked like. This one is, I think, at UCLA where the first node was delivered. This was $100,000 expenditure in 1969, and roughly multiply by 5 or so to get today's dollars. So you're looking at a fair chunk of money for something that you can now buy that is considerably more capable and considerably more more capacity and more functionality, and you can buy it off the shelves at any commodity store for $50 or $20 these days, or it's just incorporated for free as bigger things. So this is, and this would connect up to 3 or 4 computers, and it would connect to 3 or 4 high-speed lines. High speed in those days meant 50,000 bits per second. That's thousands, that's not millions or billions. I'm not going to use the word mega or giga here at all. But it was big time for the day. Packet switching. So here's the deal. We had terminals. You could dial up a time-sharing system, and you could type and you'd have an interaction at speeds that ranged from a low of 110 baud, which translates to 10 characters per second, up to 300 baud, 1200 baud, 120 characters per second, and maybe push it a little more over that. But that was about it. It took a long time in computer terms to make a call. You dial up and you wait for these modems to synchronize with each other. And so you're several seconds before you can send the first thing. That's the first piece of bad news. Second piece of bad news is if you look at how much of the data was going over those lines compared to what the capacity of the line is, the occupancy was down in the single digits, so 1% or something like that. Most of the time you're sitting there thinking and nothing's going back and forth, but you're paying for this line. So if you compare packet switching, in which you have a packet and you just send it and it shares the line with others, and there's another packet that's going somewhere else and it goes hop by hop, you get this kind of trade-off where the setup time is 0 because the lines are open all the time, and the efficiency can be pushed up relatively high. You don't want to push it all the way to 100% because then you get long queues, but getting up into the 50 to 70% range is perfectly straightforward. And on the other hand, you have the hop-to-hop time takes a little bit extra, and the certainty of when it's going to arrive compared to where it was sent, you may have some jitter in there. So if you're trying to do voice or video, you have to deal with some of that. As speeds have gotten bigger and bigger, faster and faster, that's all been worked out mostly. Some of the time it doesn't work so well. And on the circuit switching side, you have these other effects. Not visible from this view, but something that we all know about, is that the phone system was controlled by the phone company, heavily regulated, and the specs for it and the technological evolution all controlled through a very slow, careful process. 40-year rate of return on the expenditures were part of the investment process. And it was, up until critical point, absolutely illegal to attach anything to the phone system. I'm talking about answering machine, for example, was forbidden, and non-standard phones were forbidden, and there had to be court cases about that. I suspect that in this room, some of you are actually quite familiar with all of that. So there was not only the changes in technology, but there was also a corresponding change in the bureaucratic environment, if you will, in the organizational environment associated with all this. So that's all background. And now the project starts. Timeline is 67, 68 for the general concept. The request for proposal sent in 68. The project kicks off in the beginning of 69. The first node is installed at UCLA in September, relatively fast. I appreciated the introduction about my role in creating the request for comment series. There was a little less authority or control on my part than has been suggested. And actually, it actually is more interesting in a way. The folks in the Pentagon who organized all this divided the work up into two parts. One was a formal contract with all of the usual accoutrements of schedules and budgets and a careful selection of who's doing it for creating the routers, the IMPs, formal procurement of the long lines from AT&T to connect all of these, and then a much, much less formal, no formality at all, really, on the end of what are we going to do with this network. The IMPs were delivered to each of the 4 sites with more to come, and the heads of the projects were told, go try to make use of it. Well, these were professors who had their research money and they had their agendas, and so they pawned it off on the available cheap talent, graduate students, and I happened to be among those who were in the right place at the right time, and we got to meet each other. There was an initial meeting August 68, so almost exactly 50 years ago, in which a few of us met from these 4 sites. And then we started to think, well, what are we going to do with this thing? We had the good fortune that because we were computer science students, a fair amount of experience with the system side of things, operating systems, programming languages, et cetera. We could think about how to integrate this and what the impact was. But we also knew that we had zero authority. We met intermittently for a few months. In fact, at the first meeting, we made one of the most important and amusing, in a way, decisions. We said we need to keep talking with each other, and let's do this by visiting each other's laboratories. Boondoggle time. So we basically wrote ourselves a blank check to visit each other's laboratories. Now we're not talking about worldwide travel, which came later, but even just going up to Northern California from Southern California was good. And we got to talk to interesting people. And we knew that this network, which was supposed to save travel and make it possible to collaborate at a distance, first thing we did was blow the travel budgets for our bosses. And my boss, Len Kleinrock, actually had to go ask for more money and get a formal change to the contract for my personal travel. But we didn't have any formal authority imposed on us or foisted, and certainly nobody came along and said, Crocker, you're in charge. And so we met as a collegial group, and after several months in I think it was March of '69, we still didn't have the specs as to what this network was going to actually look like, so we didn't know what the low-level parts of what our computers were going to say to these routers. But we had these bigger ideas, and we said, well, let's start writing them down. And we sat around a table that wasn't very big. It fits sort of in the floor here, and identified different people who had been talking about different ideas. We said, okay, you write that up, I'll write this up, and so forth. And then I casually said, and I'll take the administrative burden of organizing these. And then I couldn't get any sleep, because every time I started to scribble down the really simple idea about just organizing these notes, I was very afraid. And what I was afraid of was that somebody would come along, an adult, I mean, we were in our 20s basically, some adult would come from the East, no doubt, I wasn't sure whether it'd be from Boston or from Washington, and say, you know, who are you, kid, what are you doing, and who gave you authority? And so after a couple of false starts at trying to scribble what should have been a very modest administrative memo, and turned out to be even more modest when I finally got it done, late one night, I sort of forced myself, I could feel the pressure of time, and scribbled the really basic rules. I said, write anything you want, doesn't have to be complete. You can write questions without answers. You could write a design without an implementation. You could write questions. All you have to do is put your name on it, a date, your institution, a title, and I'll give you a number. So we have a numbered set of notes, but you have to write it before I give you the number because I don't want a lot of holes in the series. And then I said, and just to emphasize that these things have no authority, just to emphasize that this is an open process, we'll call these things requests for comments. And so RFC 1, RFC 2, RFC 3, and so forth. The memo that I'm talking about is actually RFC 3. RFC 1 I wrote to discharge my obligation to write a technical thing. My son reminded me a couple of days ago that it was 49 years ago, a few days ago, April 7th, so last week, that we did that. And it was a temporary hack. I thought it would last for a few months until we had some formal documentation. And I was rather surprised when we had to write an index for the first 100, and even more surprised when I was invited to do a retrospective for RFC 1000. And we're now up into the 8,000s or so, except that in those days, there was no network. We had no electronic communication, so these things were shared by postal mail to each other. And some of the early RFCs were a list of the postal addresses. Every time we added somebody, we wrote another RFC and sent that out. So I have a whole bunch of RFCs to my name, but many of them are just mailing list additions. Now we have email interaction for these things, and there's an intermediate level of notes called internet drafts. And so the 8,000 or whatever the number is today probably translates into 10 or more likely 100-fold measure by comparison to what we're doing now. So a lot of stuff going on, a lot of people. And so that's that part of the story. I'll come back to it a little bit. In any case, the first imp was delivered in September, and then they came a month after that. SRI got theirs in October, and Santa Barbara and Utah before the end of the year. This was a little bit later. We had cross-country lines, and you could still sort of draw a network like this. 50,000 bits per second. These were analog lines, and they were not a single analog line. They were 12 voice grade lines bonded together with a very complicated multiplexing modem. That was sort of a big thing. A box holding the 3 or 4 modems was half the size of the imp, and it too cost a pretty penny. So as I said, the game plan was we connect these sites together, use a separate computer for routing the packets between these. One of the things that was a fortunate moment in time was that the government rate for these high-speed lines was within the budget that the office could afford. The previous planning had been to use much slower speed lines, and so that was a big jump up. Standard contracts, as I said, for the routers and communication lines, and then what I've suggested at the bottom in very bland terms as a user-driven protocol process was this informal collection of graduate students and staff people from these sites trying to figure out what were we going to use this network for, what were the protocols look like, and how to navigate our way through that. And there were a couple of interesting hurdles. One of the hurdles was that computers in those days did not come with any natural way to plug it into something else. The mindset, if you will, of a computer in those days was it was the center of its own world. And it connected to peripherals, they were called, card readers and printers and tape drives and so forth. But it was like the center of its own world, and then it would touch various things, but everything reported into it. And if you put another computer next to it, there was just no natural way for them to talk to each other. Today, every computer comes with lots and lots of communication mechanisms, but it wasn't true in those days. So just figuring out how to sort of break the shell and figure out where you plug a wire into was a non-trivial technical task. And then, of course, once you've got the wires connected, what are they going to say? The operating system doesn't know anything about it, so we were modifying the operating system, trying to build abstractions that would be robust enough and simple enough that we could say everybody should implement something that looks like this, and then you'd have a low level of interoperability, and then you build from there. So that led very naturally to a strategy of stratifying and slicing the technical design problem into the thinnest possible layers. So that led to the layered approach to protocols. And then, as I said, because of the environment that we were in, where we weren't competing for funding and we were purely in research mode, a natural tendency toward openness. And the openness was twofold in that sense. It was all of our documentation was available for free, and anything that all of our meetings and interactions, people were welcome to join. And so this nascent little group that sat around a table that I was describing grew and grew and grew. Pretty soon it got to be unwieldy. We had 50 people, and we had to divide it up into 2 parallel working groups. Now, the Internet Engineering Task Force has 100 plus parallel working groups as 1,500 to 2,000 people show up at meetings 3 times a year. Most of the work is done over the network. And it's a sort of qualitatively different process. But this openness is one of the key things. And the heterogeneous nature of the network also turned out to be one of those very fortunate, sort of as the twig is bent kind of events. We didn't get tangled up with the peculiarities of how one vendor organized its operating system versus another. We took the simplest and most portable and robust ideas. So in those days, for example, the representation for characters was not standardized. IBM used EBCDIC, extended binary coded interchange coding, I think. I don't have it precisely right. ASCII was just beginning to be used. And there were a variety of other things. The size of a character was 6 bits, 7 bits, 8 bits, or 9 bits, depending upon what machine you were on. In fact, the term byte was not yet in common use because many computers had the unit of information was not a multiple of 8. One of the more common machines of the day had 36-bit words. And instead of today, everything's a multiple of 8. So the fact that there was that much discrepancy or differences meant that we had to sort of tear apart into very, very fundamental, simple, basic ideas. And but what we did, whatever we did there, was going to be applicable to the next machine and the next machine and the next machine because it wasn't biased. It wasn't IBM, which was the dominant computer company of the day, for example. And if you didn't have an IBM computer, you couldn't connect. Or a Digital Equipment Corporation computer, et cetera. So the fact that the network was composed of heterogeneous machines, and we had this layered protocol idea, and we had this openness in the architecture, in the standards, and in the availability of the documents. These played a very, very big role then and continuing onward. So today, if you dig into the internet protocol stack, it's often represented in an hourglass form where the internet protocol layer in the middle is sort of a narrow waist that everything fits to. And then there is quite a bit of variation below it for different transmissions and enormous variation above it, different layers of protocols. So you have multiplicity of uses and diversity of transmission and changes that take place over time. New protocols being invented at the top, new transmission mechanisms, new kinds of low-level networks that can be plugged in, and all of this interoperates reasonably well. So in fact, if you just look at the upper part of that, here's HTTP and SMTP and DNS and SIP, which were mentioned. These are the protocols that underlie the web, email, the name lookup process, and voice and other operations that use SIP for session initiation. And then you have all kinds of services built on top and many more that you know about. And another aspect of this openness was anybody can play. Here's some of the major contributions and the people behind them and their nationality. So this was not a US specific or worse yet, a classified or Defense Department specific network. So where are we now? Half the people in the world, give or take, have some sort of access to the network, often over cell phones. Nobody has any idea of how many computers are actually connected, and we're just going to keep going. Here's some measures of the amount of data. They're just big numbers, and they're going to get bigger. And they're very important if you're a marketing person or you want to size, if you're a venture capitalist, you want to know what size of the market you're going to get. They're very important if you're a vendor and you're trying to produce components that are going to get used, et cetera. A lot of things that are waiting to be done. We're well into, but far from done with the e-commerce side of things. We've been disrupting various businesses. We're still sorting out privacy issues. We're still sorting out fraud and use of cryptography for trying to protect ourselves and at the same time not do other kinds of harm. All kinds of regulatory, quasi-regulatory, informal, cooperative organizations that try to get a degree of cooperation without overdoing it are still in formation. I just stepped down on a very modest, narrow, small operation called ICANN that oversees the domain name system, top level of the domain name system, and other unique identifiers. This very tiny, narrow little body has a budget that runs $140 or so million a year and has meetings around the world 3 times a year and takes up the time of hundreds of people working directly for the organization and thousands of people who invest quite a bit of time from the community on all of that. And that, as I say, is just a narrow portion of the total space. Lots of other unfinished business. I won't spend too much time on the whole picture. We'll get to little pieces. A lot of technology issues to dig into. Internet of Things is taking over. It will cause an order of magnitude or more explosion in the number of devices connected to the network. It'll no longer be related to the number of people on the network. You'll have devices that are, hundreds or thousands of devices that are unattended or you don't have a particular person associated with them. And that, as I suggested at the beginning, from a scaling point of view, will cause yet new things to be problematic. We are bedeviled with malware, with software that's buggy. I remain very disappointed about the state of affairs there. And then you have an awful lot of focus by people who are not the ones who build the software or the computer scientists, but you have a variety of people from all walks of life, social scientists and politicians and philosophers and business people and so forth, who worry about the rules of the road and where is all this going. Big, big discussions. And some interesting stuff for real. My very good friend Vint Cerf has had a bee in his bonnet since high school about space and has put a lot of work into bringing the internet into space, helping JPL build interplanetary extensions to the internet with protocols that are tuned to the problems of operating in the space. What kind of problems are there? The delays are bigger than anything we imagined when we were building terrestrial networks. And so if you look at the size of the buffers and the expected delay times for TCP, you can't just sort of port those over to this and have it work. And then another small problem is that these guys move around, these planets move around. You can't see them all the time. And so if you're going to get something from point A to point B, you may need to stage it or hold it and so forth. So a new set of protocols have emerged there and are in operation and having an impact. And then one could project even farther out to the future. But I want to come back to the dark side a little bit. There. Here's a very recent report from the RAND Corporation. Some competent people looked at quality of information that we as a society use and how we make decisions and how much we depend upon truth versus fake news, et cetera. This is available online, and it's a meaty, substantive report, and it will be the beginning, I think, of a lot of interesting work. And as I mentioned, attached to this slide is the URL, so you can get to it. Another big area is the Internet of Things. As I said, I went to a meeting a couple weeks ago in Washington on the cybersecurity aspects of the Internet of Things. This is one of the presenters, and a couple other key presenters are in the second slide that I showed of acknowledgments. And here's a number of the elements related to security aspects for the Internet of Things. Different topic, more modest in a way, but getting a lot of attention is this term network neutrality. Who controls what's allowed to be sent over individual pipes? These are headlines taken quite recently, over the last couple months, basically, from different periodicals. And as I said, the references are all in there. But it got me thinking that about old man Stroger. And as you heard, he had a little problem, and he was losing business, as we understand. And he learned that it was because his traffic was being stolen. Well, that's bad, but he did something about it. He went and invented the switch that became actually used to automate the transfer of calls and thereby sort of mitigated or solved the problem about the self-interest of the operator versus serving the public in a uniform and natural way. So he invented the switch and started a company, and that was the initial stepping switch. And so I hereby nominate him to be the father of network neutrality. Thank you. I don't know where we are in time. I'm happy to talk or not.
Time for questions. I remember reading about 5 years ago that Google, somebody from Google, the conference was bragging that they knew when flu epidemics were coming forward before the Center for Disease Control on the planet. And this whole notion of companies capturing that amount of information, quite frankly, I find companies like Google and Facebook to be pretty scary entities. Whether such capabilities could be the tools of the totalitarian, or whether you can support one political view over others with censorship. Do you see any technological perspectives, or do you think that's a sociological and a regulatory perspective?
This is a great question, and it relates directly to this big theme that I was trying to suggest, which is this may feel like a brand new problem. This may feel like a pressing and urgent issue that is unique. I think it's part of a much bigger picture, which is we have been in the business, we humans, of creating technology and then dealing with the consequences of that. Many cases, it's very positive, but it also tends to be quite disruptive. And it changes our lives. It makes possible a lot of things, but equally, one can list the various negatives. And so you've picked out a particular one, which is the aggregation of information about everybody. And that enables, as you said, anticipating or predicting epidemics. And it isn't just Google. I actually had a conversation with a colleague quite some time ago. I think it was kind of in the wake of 9/11, that if you could tell whether or not there was a rise in the purchase of aspirin at pharmacies in an area, you might have a sense that there was a flu epidemic coming, and if you could get hold of that information from the pharmacies, that you would that would be useful. That turns out to be a tiny and relatively straightforward example of the kind of thing you're talking about. So it isn't just Google, it isn't just Facebook. I think a more helpful view is it's going to be possible to get this data, as we've seen. It will be done. And now you have, as you suggest, what are you going to do about that? If you overregulate, then you prevent certain things happening, or you make it done on the down low, on the dark side. People will do it, and you won't have any visibility to do it. So on the other side, you can say, well, let's be clueful about our regulation. Let's be clueful about both encouraging and limiting, and let's try to be open and transparent about it. And there is no magic solution. You just have to struggle through it, because any of the simple solutions will turn out to have as many negative consequences as positive. So it's not that that's a non-issue, but it also is not a trivial and quick issue. And that's kind of the maximum wisdom that I'm going to impart. You guys will be around a lot longer than I am and have plenty of time to work on this. Did that shut down everybody? Huh.
So as the internet has developed, it's kind of seemed as though all communication technology is kind of converged into the internet. So like now voice services are being offered over the internet, and different kinds of telecommunication are possible. So with like the decisions that the FCC made at like the Computer 1 and Computer 2 conferences, like distinguishing telecommunications from information services, but all of it is existing in the same space now, are they going to have to figure out a way to divide the internet itself into these uses for like premium tiered information services as opposed to straight telecommunication?
Yeah. We could see this coming, actually. Some of the early writings about, even in the ARPANET, where we looked at the efficiency of packet switching, and then you watch the Moore's Law effect, you could predict that moving data over voice lines would be reversed, and you'd be moving voice over data lines, and that's exactly what's happened. And then that poses, as you said, this regulatory problem of, gosh, from a regulatory point of view, everything's organized in terms of voice lines and the rules associated with that, and those are very poor fit with the facts. The poor FCC. Yesterday's technology in today's world. I have made a point of not becoming expert in the various parts of that regulatory process, because it's just an endless abyss, basically. But the economic facts are going to be inescapable. So today you do have basically all of the traffic, whether it's voice or data, going over the same thing. Dividing that up isn't going to get you anywhere. It's going to be a bad idea. On the other hand, you have marketing forces, and the kind of marketing forces are the same as in every industry. You get offered a bundle of higher price, but you get more. You can avoid advertising and various kinds of things. And as I say, it's a bit of a mess. I don't know where it's going to settle out, but I think the healthiest approach is to acknowledge that there's no escape from understanding what those forces are, and that those forces are going to have their way one way or the other on the existing structure. And so you get to decide whether you're going to try to stay ahead of the game or just get pushed by it. Question over there.
So to be more specific about these forces, I saw a video yesterday regarding Mark Zuckerberg's trial for the recent Cambridge Analytica case. And it seems that even our authorities are not well apprised of the latest technologies in internet. And they're having a tough time putting Mark Zuckerberg on the trial because they themselves didn't know much about the internet. So do you think there should be certain programs for government agencies to be kept well apprised about these technologies? Because they would be way behind the technology that's going on in the world. And we are entrusting them with basically to control these companies.
I love this question. I'm going to take what you said and tease it apart into a bunch of component parts, and because I think it's helpful to do. And I think you've put your finger on a couple of key things. First of all, it isn't really a trial, although it probably felt like that to Mark. He was testifying before the Senate yesterday, day before yesterday, I guess, and yesterday before the House. One of the comments, I watched good portions of it as I could during that. One of the comments was that the senators didn't really get to him very much. They didn't sort of lay a glove on him too much. It was also commented that the average age of the senators was pretty old. The representatives in the House are younger. They have the benefit, of course, of a day's reflection on what happened in the Senate, and they were, by and large, more technologically savvy. Although, in fairness, they both have competent staff people who are supposed to know this stuff. So one of the effects is they're going to have to learn a bit more than they knew before. They probably knew more than they acknowledged, and now they have to pay attention to it. And there's a lot of other forces operating there. You closed with suggesting that perhaps there ought to be some obligation or some rules for our elected representatives to know more than they do. Great idea. I don't need to say anything more about that. Get out and vote. Next question. Yes, sir.
The conversion from IP version 4 to IP version 6 to get more address space was a huge scalability problem. Did anybody around that early table say, hey, 32 bits is not enough?
Yeah. The short answer is no. It seemed like a big number. 32 bits is 4 billion. It was hard to imagine that they'd run out. You don't get to use all 4 billion because they're not allocated 1, 2, 3, 4. You do it in clumps and then subclumps and so forth. But nonetheless, it seemed like a pretty big number. The situation is even worse in that in the design of the protocols at the outset, one of the substantial errors that we made, and I have some personal responsibility, is that we did not treat addresses as objects in the computer science sense of like object-oriented programming, in which case if we had, then it would have been relatively easy, or at least easier, to substitute a different instantiation of address, and it would be known everywhere. So we did unfortunate things like for the file transfer protocol, which was one of the early protocols, you'd try to open up a connection between your machine and the next machine, and the initial exchange of messages was an agreement on what addresses to use for the actual transfer of the file. And those addresses that were transmitted back and forth were transmitted as data in a data sense and not identified in a particular way. So now if you have a middle box that's trying to do translation of this, it would have to know an awful lot about the state of the communication to understand that. So we got that wrong. We got that wrong twice in a sense of not treating addresses in a way that would allow easy change over time. And the 32-bit decision, which is one that Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf were responsible for, seemed plenty big at the time. And then there was actually a very substantial third error, which was when the IETF focused on, okay, we got to deal with this. The expectation about how the transition would take place from IPv4 to IPv6 was wishful. Everybody would run both protocols, and then when everybody had IPv6 stack and IPv6 addresses, you could just turn off the IPv4. There was no incentive really for all of these distributed operations to run IPv6, and now we have quite a big mess. I don't know where it's going to go, but IPv6 is the way sometimes I talk about IPv6. Do I have time for a little bit of a shaggy dog story? One of the great things about being involved in this is a certain amount of travel. And in traveling to India, one of the droll things was the way in which Indians use the English language. It's even worse than British versus American, of two cultures divided by a common language is the common thing. But in India, so you'd be traveling along, say on an airplane or a train, and be offered some food, and it will be either vegetarian or non-vegetarian. Non-vegetarian? Might be chicken, might be fish, might be lamb, but it just says non-vegetarian. So one day, I had a group that we had put together in India, and I took them out to lunch at a fancy hotel, and I'm having a conversation with all the people around the table. And there was a young woman who was very loquacious, and she's chatting up about her background and the background of another young woman who had come out of a program that I was aware of. And I was quite aware that there were 2 men and 2 women who had come out of that program, and the 2 women happened to come to work for our company, and the 2 men went off and do something else. But but as she's talking, she's very, very chatty, and she said, and this other woman came out of there. And so I said, kind of tongue-in-cheek, were there only women in the program? She said, oh, no, we had non-women, too. December 19, 1995, my head went spinning. I was going to come home and write an article for Atlantic or New Yorker or something. My daughter thought it was a great idea. My wife said, don't touch it. You have no business talking about feminist vocabulary. But it really opened up my thinking. You can imagine, so I was at Google yesterday, and they're very advanced in their restrooms. But you can imagine going down the hall and seeing a sign that says women and another one that says non-women. Haven't seen it. But leveraging off of that, I've given a number of talks about addressing, internet addressing, and rather than talking about IPv4 versus IPv6 or IPv6 being the addressing scheme of the future, try to get people to think about 2 kinds of addressing, IPv6 and non-IPv6 addresses. So, anything else?
Can I extend off that just a little bit?
Yeah.
Are there other things in the internet's architecture that you think will be limiters in the future, things we should be looking towards?
That's a great question. Are there limiters, other limiters besides those? We built the network with a very loose attitude about security in 2 different ways. The architectures of the machines on the network are full of holes, full of bugs, and continue to be. That's a whole separate subject, and I'll just park that for a minute. And the other is that we didn't have access to the modern kinds of cryptography that we have available today. And when I say we didn't have access to it, there are different elements of that. The asymmetric cryptography, RSA algorithm, and certainly the elliptic curve algorithms were not known and not available for general use. We know now from history that the British intelligence service, GCHQ, had invented the RSA type cryptography, but it was sitting on the shelf and not getting used. There was also really active negative pressure from our government, from the intelligence agencies, from NSA in particular, about academic use academic research and publishing of papers in cryptography. They felt they owned the territory. And another very pragmatic thing was that cryptographic algorithms take a certain amount of computer time, which in those days was a much bigger deal. And so if you're going to encrypt all your traffic, you were going to do it all in software, it was going to slow things down. So for a variety of reasons, we did not build deeply into the beginnings the kind of things that we might have done if we were starting from scratch. And that's playing itself out in an ugly way. And so we don't have strong identification and authentication mechanisms ubiquitously and seamlessly available. And there's various bits and pieces are coming together. People are trying things out, but it's going to be a long, messy process. Yes, sir.
When you guys designed the first bits of the network, you designed it in a way of free sharing information and being able to keep things linked together. And with recently the protections of the government with the repeal from FCC, do you think it's a danger to the openness of the internet?
I got most of what you said. Say it once again.
Okay. When you designed the network first, you designed it in an open and free environment to share information.
Right.
With the government's and the FCC's recent repeal on the protections, do you think it might be a danger to the openness of the internet?
Well, I've tried to touch on that as I talk. One element of the openness is that everybody's concerned about is the surveillance aspect, and the surveillance aspect has got, if you like, multiple bad guys. You have government, intrusively watching everything, except these things always have two sides. The government is trying to protect you, they would say. But you also have other people who are watching your data and using it in ways that you don't like, including ISPs who want to charge more for certain kinds of traffic than for others, and so that's the network neutrality kind of thing. There was a court decision a few years ago declaring, in effect, that if there were two providers, a cable provider and a regular telco company provider, that was enough to ensure competition, and therefore they didn't need to intrude in the business practices. And the underlying issue was that these companies were enforcing restrictions on which movies you could watch, only the ones that they provided and so forth, getting up into the content space. And I remember thinking, I now want all my traffic encrypted to protect it from the ISP, not from the government. Again, these are things which we're going to have to work out. And it's a very, very interesting time because there are some very earnest folks that give you tools for encrypting your traffic and controlling it yourself. It is much, much harder to use those tools than what you get off the shelf. And they're not coming built in and ubiquitous from what you get from Microsoft, Google, Apple, etc. And the government is, on the surveillance side and the law enforcement side, is working very actively with the big companies. So I'm not too hopeful that high quality anti-surveillance kind of architectures are going to become dominant and ubiquitous, but I am hopeful that they're available there for those who want it and use it. And it'll be quite some time before we know where that pendulum settles down.
So when the ARPANET was created and then the NSFNet was created, were those created at like the same time, or did you use the existing infrastructure from the ARPANET to create the NSFNet?
Good question. And the question was sort of the relative sequencing of ARPANET, NSFNet, and so forth. So a point that I glossed over quickly was one of the impacts of the ARPANET was a consciousness-raising effect. Once it was not only up and running, but even before that, once it was underway, it caused a big impact in multiple places. It caused an impact across the world. As humble graduate students, we found ourselves entertaining visitors from France and other places wanting to know what we were doing. France needed a network. UK needed a network. Canada needed a network. Canada was somewhat interesting. They wanted to connect Canadian universities. The universities, or the big ones, were along the northern border of the US. But even at the very outset of their thinking, they arrived saying, we want our data to flow east-west, not north-south. They didn't want to be dependent upon passing their data into the US and across. They wanted their own lines. Other agencies, NSF, Department of Energy, NASA, for example, all began various forms of networking projects. NSF went through a couple of different phases. There was an earlier CSNet, connecting computer science departments, and then their grander NSFNet. The ARPANET, because of the agency and because of the funding that we had, was necessarily restricted to the places that we were supporting research. So it was a relatively select, narrow set of places. And if you weren't at one of those places, you didn't get on the ARPANET. I worked for ARPA for a few years in the early 70s, and I got a call from a really good professor in Texas whose work I knew, but he was not one of our contractors. We weren't supporting him. And he said, we need to get on the ARPANET. I have money. Where do I send a check? And I said, look, I feel for you. But we couldn't do it. And NSF opened up the process for universities and colleges across the country and provided a mechanism for that. And then subsequently, the network was opened up for general ISPs, for general commercial use and so forth. But it was in sequence. So NSFNet was 80s and 90s, not in the early 70s. But there was an agreement to use the same technology. So the creation of the IP and TCP protocols was deliberately aimed at how do you interconnect independently operated networks and still have them all fit together. And that paid off internationally, it paid off interagency, and it also paid off in the ability to build different kinds of networks, packet radio, packet satellite networks, and all interconnect those instead of just one terrestrial network with a single operator.
So the nodes for the NSF were the same points of presence as the ARPANET initially?
Well, they had their own points of presence. They interacted. There were gateways in between. And
so it wasn't just confined to the computer science departments that ARPANET was doing the work in?
yeah, basically that's right. And then over time, the ARPANET withered away. And everybody joined, these big networks. In '89, approximately, the last dregs of the ARPANET were still running around in the DC area, and there was a question of how to replace that or support that, but basically all withered away. Yeah.
Did it really take governments of France and Canada showing up on your doorstep to realize that what you're doing is going to change the world?
Well, we hadn't built it when they showed up, so it was pretty fast from that point of view. But it was, as a youngster, it was instructive that the political impact of their doing it, we should do it too, was at least as compelling as a technical paper. There was work in the UK, Donald Davies and Roger Scantlebury and folks at National Physical Laboratory, and they had all the basic ideas and no money. And they could get a computer connected or whatever, and they got frozen out by just overwhelming expenditure and latitude that we had in the US, for example. The French went off and built Minitel, which was a walled garden kind of system that was very successful and very limited, and had a very nice run, and then, got overcome by everything. On my first trip to India, I went to Bangalore, and I visited a subsidiary of an American company, a freestanding Indian company, and the Indian Institute of Science, a university. And I could send emails, this was September '94, I could send email back and forth across the city and make plans and talk to people. When I sort of peeled back the cover, I said, I wonder how they're connected. All the messages went into the US and back. The U.S. subsidiary had a lease line basically from India back into California. The freestanding Indian company had access to a satellite network for an industrial park, and the Indian Institute of Science was connected to a kind of an extension of NSFNet, actually, on a cooperative academic network arrangement. And I thought, well, there's a new form of colonialism. Fortunately, I can tell you that India has quite a lot of networking on its own these days. Anything else?
Will the effects of like China and India like progressively becoming a bigger part of like the first world, will that like affect the internet in like an exponentially adverse way here soon?
I was with you till the last moment.
Like just how fast their population.
No, I understand the question. And for the benefit, the rise of India and China, which are the two countries with the largest populations, will that affect the internet in an adverse way? If we take out the word adverse, yeah, it's going to affect the network in a lot of ways. It's a scaling issue first and foremost. It has a big political impact. I mentioned that I've been involved with ICANN, and we have a lot of politics, and there's a lot of pressure to have representation from every segment geographically and every other aspect. And the values in those cultures are not necessarily identical. So the Chinese are famous for their great firewall and for their population that doesn't have the same sense of First Amendment rights that we have here, for example. And so you get a lot of discussion about what the relationship is between the technology and the values that we have here. So it'll have an effect. But I won't necessarily say it'll have an adverse effect. I think that would be sort of too xenophobic, perhaps. Yeah.
I think there's another class coming in here, so I think we're going to have to say thank you once again.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.